Now from Washington, D.C. is Behnam Ben Taleblu. He's the Senior Director of the Iran Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. It's good to have you with us.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So the U.S. plans to escort, or not escort, but at least somehow allow neutral ships through the Strait of Hormuz. Describe this mission for us. Is it primarily designed to restore freedom of navigation? Or does it also serve as a way to test how far Iran is willing to go to disrupt tanker traffic?
You know, it's an excellent question because forgive me, in your statement just there, there's more questions than answers. Is this escorting? Is this guiding? And who is this directed at? Right now, if we're going to read the tea leaves on the Trump administration's intent to do this, and we'll see after tomorrow how they physically implement it, it's designed to calm markets. It's designed to restore confidence in shippers, particularly private shippers. It's designed to assuage America's Arab allies in the Persian Gulf. Is designed to project resolve and bolster deterrence against the Islamic Republic of Iran amid this larger game of chicken with that regime during a ceasefire. So this mission is designed to do a lot of things, and that's quite a tall order for a mission right now that, even as you just mentioned, we're not exactly sure physically how it's going to be getting off the ground. So keep your eyes and ears peeled on the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz for most of Monday as to how the CENTCOM actually uses those assets in theater, particularly the ISR, what it detects, what it believes is and is not a threat, and if it chooses to respond to anything, be that a projectile or anything else that the Iranians launch, like fast attack craft.
It's interesting when you think of what happened in recent weeks when the president announced the Strait of Hormuz was open. Merchant ships were unwilling to take that risk. And it sounds from those we've already spoken to so far, we just heard from my colleague Christy Listout, that they're unwilling to take that risk yet again. So even if the US president says it's open and there's going to be some sort of, guide through the strait, I can't imagine there's going to be much change tomorrow.
Well, some of them have been willing to run risks, and particularly those transporting liquefied petroleum gas. But some is not sufficient to address not necessarily just the supply issue, but the price issue, which is tied to that. And that's global, not just regional. Just because some are paying more in East Asia doesn't mean Americans here at home are not going to be feeling the cost and the consequences of that at the pump. The flip side, of course, does have to be mentioned, that the Islamic Republic of Iran, at a minimum, put 12 mines in some of the narrower parts of the Strait of Hormuz that they now claim they cannot find, and have allegedly been still firing projectiles into this area at civilian and commercial tankers. And the U.S. effort to bring more assets into theater are designed to blockade Tehran's ports and force them to reconsider. So if Tehran is trying to shut down global shipping, the U.S. is now trying to shut down Iranian shipping, while also now trying to find a more creative way to get the tankers and vessels that are on the opposite side of the Persian Gulf free and safe to come out. And right now, that is much more of a vibes thing than a policy thing. But again, keep your eyes and ears peeled on the Persian Gulf May 4th moving forward to see who tests that, who believes that, and how the Iranians respond.
I mean, it certainly seems clear that Iran still retains the ability to disrupt shipping through the Strait of Hormuz and therefore influence global energy prices. Does that mean that Tehran essentially holds the leverage here over global markets?
Not necessarily. The Islamic Republic of Iran could always have fired a $40,000 drone, if not a cheaper drone, from its territory. If that is something that is going to cripple shipping markets, I think, both the United States as well as some Arab countries in the Persian Gulf, as well as the global shipping industry, are going to have a real rethink about their posture in the region. But fundamentally, I think there is no way out of the strait than through. I think it would be best if the U.S. used the period of the ceasefire, which, by the way, has been extended, and the U.S. and Iran continue to pass messages to each other, to find a way to actually open up some of the areas that were mined, to actually now be putting together a broad international coalition, not necessarily for an escort, but to engage in demining and have the Iranians test, will the regime fire on an international demining mission to clear some of the narrower parts of the strait and perhaps have that physically restore confidence.
Of course, following the announcement of this U.S. escort mission, prices, in terms of oil prices, eased slightly. Does that suggest that markets believe that this operation could potentially reduce the risk, or are traders simply waiting to see how Iran responds?
Well, there's a seesaw, particularly for traders, but also for consumers. There's a seesaw effect here. There's Iran's actions, there's the president's rhetoric, and there's the great delta in between. So taking a short-term snapshot approach, yes, in the immediate response to the launching of this mission, yes, there's a slight easing in terms of price. But again, we'll have to see how the Iranians respond and how the U.S. responds, both politically, based on what the president says, and kinetically, if CENTCOM does anything to see if oil prices spike. And my guess is that if there is a response, there will be a short-term spike. But that's, you touched on something very important here, which is not just during the period of war, but during the period of ceasefire, that the president and the U.S. military mission are highly responsive to external stimuli, particularly markets and media. And the Islamic Republic's success, to go back to your question about leverage, is not just about firing these projectiles, but turning a conflict that was initially rooted in hard political issues, in hard security issues, and turning them and transforming them and translating them into issues of energy and economics.
Yeah, exactly. Behnam Ben Taleblu, some great analysis there. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you.